Thank you very much, everyone, for coming to the Bystander Approach Conference, which the Northern Ireland Executive Violence Against Women and Girls is holding today in the Long Gallery at Stormont. We know that many of you are joining us from other places in Northern Ireland and beyond, and we're delighted to welcome you and also delighted to welcome our audience in the room. Today we have messages from two of our executive ministers, from Minister Hargey, who's here with us, and from Minister Swan. The head of the Civil Service is going to speak to us, and then we're going to hear from Dr. Jackson Katz, the co-founder of the Mentors in Violence Prevention programme from the United States, from some of our young advocates here in Belfast who are going to share their great Share to Be Aware video, from Dr. Louise Crowley from the School of Law and University College Cork. There's then going to be a panel discussion, which is also going to feature Graham Goulden from Scotland and Elaine Crory and Sarah Mason from here in Belfast. There will be an opportunity to take part in a focus group discussion, and finally we'll reflect on our responses and what's next. We've got a comfort break coming up at about 3 o'clock if you wonder when to recharge your coffee cup, and we'll be finishing at 4:15. So I'd like to start by calling on the head of the Civil Service, Jane Brady.
Good afternoon, everyone. You're so welcome here to Parliament Buildings, and for those joining us online, delighted you can join us. Thank you so much to Claire for all our preparations and the team in bringing everything together so seamlessly today, and looking forward to this afternoon's sessions. As Claire has mentioned, the strategy for tackling violence against women and girls is an executive strategy, and we have cross-departmental support. So I'm so delighted that we have a number of our ministers here today speaking. First, I'd like to invite a short video clip from the Minister of Health, Robin Swan. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm sorry I'm not able to join you in person as I had originally hoped. Nevertheless, thank you for the invite and giving me the opportunity to make a few remarks on this important event. I welcome the Executive Office's commitment to develop a new Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, and I look forward to seeing its progress over the coming months. There will, of course, be close linkages within the work that my department is taking forward. Many joining today's conference will be aware that my department leads jointly with the Department of Justice on the delivery of the Stopping Domestic and Sexual Violence and Abuse strategy. Our current strategy is now in its final year, and we, like the Executive Office, are also embarking on the development of a new strategy. A separate framework with specific commitments dedicated to tackling domestic and sexual abuse of which anyone can be a victim. I was pleased that our three departments had the opportunity to jointly launch a call for views earlier this year to actually help inform the content and overall direction of these two strategies. There was a significant response, and I think that's reflective of the considerable interest and importance placed in tackling these issues. So I'd like to thank all of the individuals and the organisations for taking the time to respond, particularly those who shared their experiences with us. And I know that many of you have been working hard for many years to support victims and survivors and to ensure that their voices are heard. It is because of you that we are here today, and I want to thank you all for what you've done and all the services that you're providing. But we also recognise that the problem is not getting any less despite all our efforts. You could say that once an incidence of violence has happened, it's already too late. We need a step change in how these issues are addressed. Working on prevention is really important, and we can all play our part. So working together across departments and across sectors. This is everyone's business, and I've no doubt that this will be one of the key messages of today's conference. I'm committed to working with all of my ministerial colleagues to challenge and address the societal attitudes and behaviours that contribute towards violence and abuse in our society. It is essential that we tackle the root causes. But as we all know, societal change will not happen overnight. I am, however, encouraged by events like today, when there is the opportunity to come together to share learning and expertise and explore positive actions that we can take forward. So I hope it encourages as many people as possible to reach out and engage in the development of these new strategies. Thank you.
Thank you to Minister Swan. Now I'd like to invite Minister Hargey, Minister for the Department for Communities, to say a few words.
Thanks very much. Firstly, Jane, and for the organisers of today's event, I think it's really important, and particularly with the media focus as well, really hones in on the important issues. But obviously this work continues even beyond the media glare or events like this, and that is down to the activism and the campaigning from people out on the ground as well. So I do want to take an opportunity to thank the organisers of today's events, the speakers and those who are contributing, but of course also those who are participating, and many of our activists who are here as well. And obviously violence against women and girls is widespread and deep-rooted problem within our society. Indeed, it has no place within our society and must stop. And freedom from violence is a fundamental right, but also a key aspect of gender equality. Women and girls are disproportionately impacted by gender-based violence, but they're also disproportionately impacted in terms of poverty, in terms of inequality, in terms of economic access and opportunities as well. And to that end, I welcome the development of a specific strategy for tackling violence against women and girls. This strategy will work alongside and be complementary to the gender equality strategy, which my department is developing on behalf of the Executive. These two strategies will work together with an aim to provide a robust spaces for addressing misogyny and tackling structural violence against women and girls. There's also a lot of work currently taking place in relation to gender equality, and at the end of the last Assembly just a few months ago, that mandate saw the passage of bills on period poverty, protection from stalking and sexual violence offences and trafficking. And in line with commitments that were laid out just over 2 years ago in the New Decade New Approach Agreement, the Executive agreed to the development and publication of a suite of 4 social inclusion strategies, which includes the new gender equality strategy, but also the anti-poverty strategy, the LGBTQI+ strategy, and the disability strategy as well. The strategies are being developed using a co-design approach with the involvement from key stakeholders at all stages of the process. And it will be the aim to bring a focus to the Executive's collective efforts to tackle gender inequality and address barriers that gender stereotypes can present. Work on the development of the gender equality strategy is ongoing and in readiness for preparation of an incoming Executive prior to a public consultation. Issues relating to violence against women and girls have been raised by stakeholders during the development of the gender equality strategy, and steps will be taken to ensure that this strategy is appropriately aligned to the new Equally Safe Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. Statistics from 2019 show that during the 18 and 19 period, 69% of all domestic abuse crime victims were women and 86% of all perpetrators were men. Here, 1 in 4 women have been the victims of domestic violence, and there are on average 85 incidents of domestic violence reported to the PSNI every day, or 1 in every 17 minutes. We also know that what is reported is only the tip of the iceberg and does not reflect the everyday acts of harassment and abuse which have become commonplace. Violence against women and girls is widespread and deep-rooted. It has no place in our society and needs to be stopped. Freedom from violence is a fundamental aspect of gender equality and a fundamental human right. We want young girls to grow up in a society where they are safe and can thrive. We want women not to face the constant fear, threat of vile misogyny and abuse. Working together to end violence against women and girls and tackling root causes can improve the health and well-being of individuals, families and communities, and have a substantial positive impact on the economy and wider society. We are here today to start a public conversation and, of course, to keep the conversation going that has been ongoing for some time on how we as a society can take action to prevent violence against women and girls and change the damaging culture and attitudes that underpin it. And I know you'll hear today in terms of some perspectives in looking at those issues, particularly the active bystander approach, which is an intervention that empowers and equips people to tackle harmful language and behaviour as they see it in their everyday lives. It's also about good leadership and creating safe spaces and building an understanding around good, healthy relationships with each other. It's powerful because it can be adopted for all sectors and communities and means that there's something that we can all do. I do hope that the discussions here today will generate new learning and ideas on how we as a society tackle violence against women and girls, create an energy for us to move forward and to build a movement of change together. And I do look forward to continuing towards a more equal society where our choices aren't limited. And I think this is really important. I mean, it was some of the work that I would be involved in. As was said, I'm the Minister in the Department for Communities. And we made a move just in December of last year where we were looking at the funding and terms and conditions for those employed within the community and voluntary sector. And when we started to look to improve those terms and conditions, particularly around paying a real living wage as a minimum, when we got the analysis back in terms of the implementation of that, it showed that almost 80% of the recipients of that change and who benefited were women. So again, you can see right away the structural inequalities that exist within government, that exist within the institutions of power right across the society, and which really hit to the grassroots and the core of our communities. And it is those inequalities, those structures that we need to challenge and change, along obviously with the culture and attitudes that roll beside them as well. So again, I'm delighted to be here at the conference. I wish you well in the remainder of this afternoon. And again, I look forward to working with you all as we develop these strategies and really build an inclusive society where international human rights are the bedrock of everything that we do going forward. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Minister Hargey. In the previous Assembly, a motion was passed for the action to eliminate gender-based violence by introducing a violence against women and girls strategy. And the Executive agreed to bring forward a strategy to tackle the root causes of violence against women and girls that must be intersectional and focus on all forms of violence, with a particular emphasis on behavioural and attitudinal change. It is recognised that tackling such a deep and widespread problem requires a whole of government and a whole of society approach that delivers cultural and societal change to ensure there are healthy behaviours and attitudes towards women and girls. The Ending Violence Against Women strategy is currently in the evidence gathering phase, which has included a call for views and a programme of research to gather evidence on what works to end violence against women. That work is already ongoing in Northern Ireland, as well as research on lived experience. Officials have met with a wide variety of people from across society, including those with lived experience, marginalised groups, organisations, practitioners and service providers, academics and researchers, and of course the general public, with a view to commencing a co-design process with key stakeholders in September of this year. The aim is to have a draft framework strategy by December 2022 and to run the strategy for 7 years, alongside the domestic and sexual abuse strategy, which is led by the Departments of Justice and of Health. For me, the message from today's conference is very clear. Violence against women and girls is a scourge in our society. It wrecks lives, it wrecks opportunities. If we are to make a real, lasting difference, we have to tackle the root causes, the damaging attitudes and behaviours that allow violence to flourish. There is something everyone can do, and our strategy will need a whole of government and a whole of society effort. Bystander training is one very promising action that many of us can take, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about it today. So as we begin today's conference, I want to extend a very warm welcome to the speakers who will be sharing their expertise and stories with us today. Firstly, Dr. Jackson Katz, who is one of the early architects of the Bystander Approach and co-founder of the Mentors in Violence Prevention programme, which was the first large-scale initiative in both sports culture and the US military. Professor Louise Crowley from the School of Law, University College Cork, who has developed the campus-wide Bystander Intervention programme, which educates and empowers staff and students to challenge the normalisation of sexual abuse and to recognise their role as active bystanders. I also welcome Graham Golden from Cultivating Minds UK, who's a retired police officer of 30 years service and who specialises in tackling all forms of men's violence, delivering leadership and bystander training to men, women and others across education, law enforcement and business. And finally, we welcome our local experts, including the Young Advocates, Women's Aid and Raise Your Voice, as well as others from across the sectors who will be sharing in the focus groups. And I hand over to Claire, who's going to talk us through the practicalities of today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Just a few words before we go on about how to take part in today. If you're in the room, the discussion groups will be taking place at the tables down at this end of the room. And our team will lead you there. If you want to ask a question of one of our speakers, please raise your hand at the end of a presentation. There's tea and coffee available throughout the day. If you're watching online, please make sure you rename yourself on Zoom to your full name so that we can assign you to your preferred discussion group later on. Remain muted throughout the presentations, but if you want to ask a question to our speakers here in the room, please use the raise your hand feature and wait until our Zoom facilitator prompts you to unmute your microphone. And throughout the online discussion groups, we'd encourage you to keep your camera on and to be mindful of background noise when you're unmuted, and I say that as the owner of 3 dogs. If someone else is speaking and you're not in a quiet environment, please remain muted. If you have any technical issues, please contact conference, CONFERENCE, at planned, PLANND.co.uk, who are our tech support today. That's conference at planned, with no E, PLANND.co.uk. We'd encourage you to talk about this afternoon's conference on your social media, and if you'd like to use the hashtag EVAWGNI, then EVAWGNI, ending violence against women and girls in Northern Ireland. So that's the housekeeping. I should say that there are no fire drills planned for today, so we'll be first to the exit if you do hear a fire alarm. But I'd like now to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Jackson Katz will be well known to many of you from the United States, and one of the and I keep saying inventors, and he goes, oh, no, but he is one of the inventors of this approach, of the bystander approach. He has developed the Mentors in Violence Prevention programme, a programme which he has delivered and spoken about in all continents except Antarctica. He has produced documentaries, Tough Guys, GUISE. He has written books. He has done an excellent TED Talk, which has been translated into 27 languages and watched by over 5 million people. And if you're looking for more about his approach, it's a very rich source. But we have the privilege now of Dr. Katz addressing our conference. Jackson, you're very welcome.
And I also very much appreciated Jane's comments and Minister Hargey's comments. I'm going to say a few things before we get to the bystander stuff. The problem of men's violence against women is a global problem. It's obviously a local problem here in Northern Ireland, but it's a huge problem in my country, but it's a problem everywhere. women's leadership in a multiracial, multi-ethnic sense here and all over the world has been utterly transformative over the last 50 years and even more. The changes in laws, the reform of laws, the holding offenders accountable, the providing services to victims and survivors, and to the extent that we've had prevention programming embedded in schools and everywhere else, to the extent that any of that's been happening, it's because of women's leadership. And by the way, everybody benefits from this leadership, not just women and girls. Men and boys have profoundly been affected in a really positive way by women's leadership and advocacy in these areas. And people beyond the binary definitions of men and women, everybody has benefited. I want to say that publicly. I think it's really important, especially when men like myself have the platform, have the spotlight. It's so important that we say that we honor, respect, and have great gratitude for the leadership and advocacy of women in the domestic and sexual violence fields. There's an awful lot of people that you've helped and continue to help, and it's not just women and girls, it's also men and boys. And this nonsense that somehow this is anti-male, it's nonsense somehow it's nonsensical to call this anti-male, to call the women who are doing this work against men. It's just total, I'll just use an American colloquialism, it's total BS to say that this is anti-male, to talk about this subject matter. And I urge you, if you don't remember anything else that I've said today, we need more men who have the courage, the strength, and the self-confidence to say that, and say it loudly, and say it proudly, and to stand with women as their partners and allies in this work, and to take some of the incoming, some of the negative stuff that so many women get for just telling basic truths about this subject matter. We need more men who are willing to stand with those women, don't you think? Who are willing to take some of the incoming criticism or whatever nonsense comes your way when you have the courage and the strength to speak truth to power and just to be honest. This is not a gender-neutral problem, okay? Men's violence against women is not a gender-neutral problem. Yes, men are victims as well. Yes, men are, and women are perpetrators as well. I understand all that. But we're here in this room because we have an ongoing pandemic of men's violence against women, not just in Northern Ireland. Isn't that the case? And just saying it out loud that it's men's violence against women and that we have to figure out how we're going to raise boys differently and we're going to have to figure out ways to engage men in a much more sophisticated and effective way than we've been doing. That's not anti-male. That's just being honest. And I hope we can be honest. I mean, we have a lot of problems in our societies and some of them are very solvable. And this is one of them that is very, very solvable. Now, I've been saying that women's leadership has been incredible, and it is, and it has been. Men's leadership hasn't been. We really haven't had anywhere near enough men. Yes, there have been men all along who have been supportive of the women who are making these efforts, whether politically, socially, educationally. I'm one of those men, so I appreciate it, and there are men in this room who have been doing good work and will continue to do good work, and men in the sound of my voice. I understand that and appreciate it, but it's nowhere near enough of us. It's still unusual to hear men say the things that I'm saying. I know that people are looking at me a little bit, which is common for me, like, oh my God, I can't believe a man just said that. I can't believe that I heard a man just say it. Or I can't believe a man just said this with passion. I've never heard that before. This is a problem. This should be normal. It should be normal to hear men talking like I'm talking. Don't you think? You know how common these problems are? You know how many men I know who have women in their lives who have been murdered, who have been assaulted, who have been harassed? And I'm talking about just guys off the street and guys in my peer culture. I don't mean just guys who are doing this kind of work. You know how pervasive it is? You know how many adult men are walking wounded from being victims of domestic and sexual violence when they were children? You know how many adult men were sexual abuse victims, usually at the hands of men, not always? You know how many adult men were boys growing up in homes where their father was abusive to their mother and who have carried the trauma from childhood? Just walk down the street. And I'm telling you, I've been doing this work a long time. I work with tons of men in all kinds of different settings all over the world. And I hear, and my colleagues hear, and Graham hears this, my colleague Graham, who you'll hear from at some point. We hear it all the time from men about how these issues have affected them in such negative ways, both things that happen to women close to them as well as stuff that happened to them and men and boys close to them. And the women in the domestic and sexual violence field have been pointing us in a direction for decades about how we can get healthier and how we can get more honest and how we can change systems and systemic practices and cultural norms. They've been talking about it and pushing for decades. It's time we have more men with the guts to join them and do it in a public way. And I'm so happy we're in the Parliament building. We're in the seat of power. Where are the men, by the way? And I'm not saying that there aren't men here, but where are the men who are in positions of leadership in your society who have distinguished themselves and honestly talked about this in the way that I'm talking about it? Because we need more of them, don't you think? All right. Am I really American in the way that I come across? Guilty as charged. I'm going to share with you an example of another man who's not an American, who has distinguished himself as a leader in this space, and I want to give you some context. It's going to be a video clip, and I'm going to set it up for you. So my colleagues and I have been working in the United States military. We were the first gender violence prevention program in the United States Department of Defense. We started in the Marine Corps in 1997. That's shockingly 25 years ago, by the way. These are not new problems. Changing systems takes time. It is unbelievably time-consuming and stressful, but you have to persist because changing systems takes time. It takes energy. It takes buy-in. But we've been working with the United States military since 1997. But we've been working with the Australian Army since 2013. And here's the context. In 2013, there was a scandal in the Australian Army where a group of junior officers and junior enlisted leaders, all of them men, were making a series of sexually degrading Facebook posts referring to their fellow female soldiers in completely degrading and unprofessional ways. And of course they were caught, because this is the digital age and you get caught. So in addition to being ethically challenged, these guys were ignoramuses to think they were somehow going to get away with this, but they didn't. They got in big trouble. It was a scandal, made it to the newspapers. The general who was then the chief of the army, General David Morrison, that's the highest ranking member of the Australian Army and the second highest ranking member of the Australian military. General Morrison made a videotape statement that went out to all the members of the Australian Army in response to the scandal. And then it went viral beyond. And I want to share with you General Morrison's statement as an example of the kind of leadership that we rarely, even to this day, hear from men in positions of institutional authority. And so I'd like to share with you General Morrison's statement. So Oren, if you could roll the Chief of Army clip, please.
Earlier today, I addressed the media, and through them the Australian public, about ongoing investigations into a group of officers and NCOs whose conduct, if proven, has not only brought the Australian Army into disrepute, but has let down every one of you and all of those whose past service has won the respect of our nation. There are limits to how much I can tell you because the investigations into this network by both the New South Wales Police and the ADF Investigative Service are ongoing. But evidence collected to date has identified a group of men within our ranks who have allegedly produced highly inappropriate material, demeaning women, and distributed it across the internet and Defence's email networks. If this is true, then the actions of these members are in direct contravention to every value the Australian Army stands for. By now, I assume you know my attitude to this type of conduct. I have stated categorically many times that the Army has to be an inclusive organisation in which every soldier, man and woman, is able to reach their full potential and is encouraged to do so. Those who think that it is okay to behave in a way that demeans or exploits their colleagues have no place in this Army. Our service has been engaged in continuous operations since 1999 and in its longest war ever in Afghanistan. On all operations, female soldiers and officers have proven themselves worthy of the best traditions of the Australian Army. They are vital to us maintaining our capability now and into the future. If that does not suit you, then get out. You may find another employer where your attitude and behaviour is acceptable, but I doubt it. The same goes for those who think that toughness is built on humiliating others. Every one of us is responsible for the culture and reputation of our Army and the environment in which we work. If you become aware of any individual degrading another, then show moral courage and take a stand against it. No one has ever explained to me how the exploitation or degradation of others enhances capability or honours the traditions of the Australian Army. I will be ruthless in ridding the Army of people who cannot live up to its values, and I need every one of you to support me in achieving this. The standard you walk past is the standard you accept. That goes for all of us, but especially those who, by their rank, have a leadership role. If we are a great national institution, if we care about the legacy left to us by those who have served before us, if we care about the legacy we leave to those who, in turn, will protect and secure Australia, then it is up to us to make a difference. If you're not up to it, find something else to do with your life. There is no place for you amongst this band of brothers and sisters.
Now imagine if it was normative and not exceptional to hear men speaking like that, and not just the generals in charge of the army. In other words, not just the most senior men with institutional authority, but just more commonly heard men talk like that, and not just be checking the box because they have to do it because it's a mandate, or we're told we have to go through this program, so just play along. But they actually committed themselves and they were communicating that. Can you imagine what the outcome would be? You know what I can imagine? We would have radically and dramatically reduced rates of domestic violence and abuse, sexual harassment, sexual assault, and all those other related crimes and abuses. And why do I say that with certainty? Because the typical perpetrator of these crimes and abuses is not a sick man, he's not a sociopath, he's not mentally ill or deeply disturbed. Of course there are those individuals, but the typical perpetrator is much more normal than that, much more everyday than that, much more average than that. In fact, on university campuses in the United States, and I'm sure this is true here too, but certainly in the university campuses in the United States, the typical man who commits rape and sexual assault doesn't see himself in any way as a rapist or a sexual assaulter. He doesn't think what he's done is wrong. He might think he's sexually aggressive, but within the normative range. If the typical perpetrator of sexual assault on university campuses thinks that what he's doing is normal, which is the case, then, by the way, that pushes us to ask a series of questions like, what does it mean to be normal? And how are the institutions of our society helping to shape what is normal? Because this is not about individual perpetration. This is not about some individual sick men or broken men. And we have to play the game of whack-a-mole where we run from one man who's committed some horrible crime to the next and try to figure out what went wrong in his life, what went wrong in his brain, or maybe he had a drinking problem, maybe this guy was a victim of some family violence and he's acting out. It's like, how naive can we be? These are systemic problems that have deeper roots. And then the minister mentioned that. You're all talking about that. It's part of what getting a strategy going to prevent men's violence against women is thinking about the structural roots and the belief systems that underlie abusive behavior, not just jumping in after the fact and, punishing the perpetrator. I mean, people need to be held accountable, but if we really want to get serious, we have to look at deeper roots and phenomena. And there's so much to be said about that. I'm just going to give you one headline on this one and then move on to the bystander stuff. We have to talk about the porn culture and how it's normalizing sexual violence by young men and men against women, against other men. It's an unbelievably influential part of the culture, and it's really, really abusive and misogynist. And anybody who thinks this is about sexual freedom hasn't been paying attention. This is not about sexual expression. It's not about sexual freedom. It's about normalizing misogyny and violent abuse. And young men are being socialized as we speak into a misogynist understanding of themselves and their, especially in this case, heterosexual men and young men, about how they treat and women and how they express themselves sexually. And if we don't talk about, by the way, I know that politically this is complicated, and we're not going to run into the schools and start talking about pornography. Don't worry, I'm not naive about this. I live in a country where it's just filled. The pornography industry is incredibly influential, and yet there's like debates about whether we should even have basic sexuality education in the schools. We're failing our kids on so many levels, okay? I know that, but I'm also not pushing you to do something you don't want to do. I'm just saying we have to talk, if we're going to be honest, about the ways in which our failure to act, our failure to be smart, our failure to be good educators, both in families and in schools and in the larger society, we're giving our kids over to the porn industry, and they're the ones who are teaching them how to be sexual in the ways that are incredibly contributing to the problems. I mean, this rough sex stuff, I've been dealing with this a lot recently in my own circles. The normalization of men strangling women, this is so pathetic on so many levels. We should be absolutely outraged by this. The normalization of men strangling women in pornography is why it's happening more and more in quote-unquote real life. We need to do better. Anyhow, General Morrison, in his statement, among the many things that he said, he said, the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. That's General Morrison's articulation of the bystander philosophy. And I was privileged to have trained General Morrison and his 10 most senior generals, to be honest with you. But anyhow, the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. The bystander approach is a way of thinking about how everybody in a given peer culture can play a constructive role in challenging or interrupting abuse, in supporting victims and survivors, and to the extent that they have influence in creating a peer culture climate or an environment in which abusive behavior is seen as completely socially unacceptable within the group. There's so many different pieces to it, and I'm sitting here, Louise Crowley is the woman, the person in Ireland and Northern Ireland who's been pioneering this all over the place. And these are basic concepts, right? I mean, it's, even as I say it out loud, it's so basic. I say everybody has a role to play, right? So I want to give you a basic overview of the history of the approach. And this is by definition, attenuated and brief. There's a lot more to this. But I just want to give you the basics of it, because I know from my experience in the last couple of days, there's a lot of people who it's new terrain for them, right? It's like, what is the bystander approach? What do you really do? And how does it look? And what does it look like? So I have the opportunity to share that some of the basics with you. And because I'm one of the early architects of this approach, you know, here we are. I'm going to use this old technology for the purpose of my, sharing this information with you. And I know for some of the younger folks, you might be a little intimidated by this technology. So I just want to explain what this is, okay? So this is an easel, and this is a flip chart, and this is a magic marker. And I'm actually going to write on the paper. And I swear to God, I'm only saying that half jokingly, because I have people in my family who are intimidated by paper. And I'll go to my grave thinking that that's crazy, but it is what it is. So, back in the early 1990s, when I was in graduate school in Boston, I approached the director of an institute at Northeastern University called the Center for the Study of Sport in Society. His name was Dr. Richard Lapchick. I approached him with the idea of creating a program that would train initially university male student athletes. And we have a big industry, you might know, in the States that you don't have here of university athletics, giant operation. And the idea was my idea was to create a program to train young men, initially just men, on athletic teams to speak out about sexual assault and domestic violence. My thinking was not that there was a problem in the athletic subculture with men assaulting women, although there was such a problem and continues to be such a problem. My thinking was, where are we going to find more men and young men who have the guts and the strength and the self-confidence to break our complicit silence and speak out on these matters? And I thought if we get men who already have some status, they've already achieved some status because of their success in athletics, if they get them to speak up, then it'll open up space beyond the insular athletic subculture. So it was a strategic thinking, really, about the global problem and the national problem of men's violence against women, and athletics is a potential part of the solution. All right, that was my thinking. So, and the center had been created in 1984 with the idea of using sport as the vehicle for social change, especially around racism and anti-racism. And sport and race issues, especially in the States, are intertwined, and it's very important. Sports plays an important role in gender equality and sexual equality and racial justice over the past 100 years. Anyhow, I knew all about that. And I also knew, as a young man, I started doing this work as a university student. I was like, how do we get more men to speak up? Just like I've been saying, how do we do it? Well, I thought sports was one vehicle. So we got funded by the United States Department of Education to create a model program. And we had this funding from the government to create a model program. We were going to be working initially with just young men. It became mixed gender. And we were going to talk to men on football, basketball, baseball, soccer, what you call football, lacrosse, hockey. We don't have hurling. Hurling hasn't made a big impact in the States yet, but if we were in Northern Ireland, we'd be working with hurling teams, wrestling, on and on. the question was, what are we going to say to these young men? We had 9 colleges and universities to begin with. What are we going to say to these young men on these teams that invites them into the conversation rather than indicts them as potential rapists and abusers? And I say invite rather than indict, because back in the day, which is to say the 1970s and the 1980s, the way that people did what they called sexual assault prevention on university campuses, and I'll use that as a specific example, was organized around this binary understanding. It was women and men. We know that there are people who are outside of the women and men binary, but back in the day we were talking about women and men. And most efforts that were called prevention efforts back in the day were focused on women, but they weren't prevention efforts. They were really risk reduction efforts under the name of prevention. So women and girls were taught, don't put your drink down at a party because a guy might drop a rape drug in your drink. Look in the back seat of your car before you get in. Have a man's voice on the voicemail. Have a buddy system. If you're going to be going out with a group of friends, you're going to be drinking, make sure you know who your friends are with and who they're going home with. All of this stuff is still taught to women and young women in urban, suburban, and rural areas. And it's still good advice, but it's not prevention. It's risk reduction, and there's a big difference because true prevention, especially primary prevention, means going to the root cause of the problem. And women and girls are not the root cause of sexual assault problem. When men and boys were focused on back in the day, it was almost always as perpetrators or potential. So the spirit of the educational message to men and young men was, you better listen up. You better know the law in Northern Ireland on sexual consent. And you need to know if you're with somebody sexually and you're pushing forward and you're not sure that they're 100% on board, if you keep going, you could be crossing the line into committing sexual assault. You need to back off. Or in a relational context, if you're getting worked up, you're getting agitated, and you know that there may be some physical expression of that agitation, you need to figure out how to de-escalate before you reach the point where you're using force, because if you cross over into using force, you've now committed a crime, domestic abuse, and therefore you need to figure out a way to not let that happen. The problem if you go into a room full of men talking to them as if they're sexual assault perpetrators or potential domestic violence abusers is that most men will shut you down and tune you out. And they'll think, who are you to talk to me like this? I don't rape women, I don't abuse my girlfriend, or I'm not one of those guys, not all men, you know, and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of guys will shut you down. Some will even be resentful and hostile. And so I'm thinking, I knew all this. By the way, this isn't quantum physics, okay? It's not that complicated, all of this stuff. It's pretty basic as far as I'm concerned. But anyhow, I knew all this. I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do we move beyond this impasse? How do we get more men to, instead of shutting down and being defensive, how do we get them empowered to speak up? And I had a professor in graduate school at the time who, along with his colleagues in the late 1980s, early 1990s, was looking at an approach to middle school bullying prevention, middle school being 13 and 14-year-old, bullying prevention. What they were doing was, instead of looking at the kid doing the bullying and the kid experiencing it, they focused on all the kids around the kid doing it and all the kids around the kid experiencing it. The goal was to get all the kids around the kid doing it, to make it clear to that kid that what he, she, or they were doing was unacceptable, not because they were going to get in trouble with the authority figure, like the teacher or the principal, the external agent of authority who was going to come into the peer culture and remove the offending party, but because the peer culture was going to police itself. The kids were going to make it clear to other kids, you can't treat kids like this. This is not okay. And you're not impressing us in any way, you know, and in fact, you've got some issues, you know. And then the goal was to get kids around the kid experiencing the bullying, to make it clear to that kid, what's happening to you is wrong. We don't support it. What can we do to help? They called that the bystander approach. And the beauty of it was that everybody in a given peer culture had a constructive role to play. What we did is we took that approach from the middle school bullying world and imported it into the sexual assault and relationship abuse prevention world. And what it did, among other things, is it gave us a very powerful argument to make to men and young men who say these aren't my issues. This is not my problem. It's not I'm a good guy. I don't do these things. We said, you know what? It's good that you're not abusive yourself, but it's not good enough because we need you to do more. We need you to make it clear to other men around you and young men around you that treating women or other men with disrespect in any way, physically, sexually, emotionally, verbally, is not okay, it's not cool, and not just because you're going to get in trouble with the authorities, but because we, in your friendship circle, on your team, in your workplace, we don't accept it. It's not cool. This is not okay. That was the bystander approach, and we employed it in the domestic and sexual violence field starting in the early 1990s through the sports sort of angle, but then it got way bigger than that, and we became mixed gender, and so we talked about everybody, not just men, and then the bystander approach grew from there. And the word bystander is sometimes misleading to people because bystander suggests standing by, and it's a little bit tricky, I understand, but I use the word bystander as a synonym for friend, teammate, classmate, colleague, co-worker, family member. In other words, there's no real category bystander that isn't just a normal person who's part of a peer culture, part of a friendship network, part of a workplace. And everybody in a sense can be part of this category, right? Literally everybody, including people in some parts of their life, they could be perpetrators or victims, but in other parts they're friends and teammates and classmates. And what can they do? What can we all do in a constructive fashion? One other key concept here about the bystander approach is if you can imagine this triangle as a pyramid, and you can imagine the tip of the pyramid is an incident of sexual assault or domestic abuse or sexual harassment. It could be a racist incident or an anti-LGBTQ incident, because conceptually it all fits. That's the tip of the pyramid. But the base is a set of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that create the cultural context and foundation underlying the tip of the pyramid or the abusive act. What that means and what that does is it opens up a lot more space for what bystanders can do, what friends, teammates, colleagues, whatever. It's not just if you see something happening right in front of you, like an assault in progress, you need to jump in. This is not a superhero model, the bystander approach. It could be something as basic as this. You're a young guy and you're hanging out with a group of your guy friends and there's no women present, and one or two of those guys start making degrading comments about young women or young women's bodies or something. If you're in that situation, what do you say or do? And if you don't say or do anything, then in a sense, isn't your silence or passivity a form of consent and complicity in their expression of sexism or misogyny? And don't we know that sexism and misogyny are not just individual acts, but they are systemically reinforced, and belief systems underlie certain other material structures that reinforce second-class status for women, for example. And isn't one of the places where attitudes and beliefs get nurtured and sustained and reproduced is in peer cultures, small and large? So what role can the individual play when you heard your friend just make a really degrading comment about women? And by the way, the direct analogy with racism is if you're a white person and you're hanging out with a group of white people and there's no people of color in the room, and one or two of those white people start making racist comments about those people of color, if you don't say something like, I'm not cool with this, you can't talk like this around me, or this is not appropriate or acceptable, whatever vernacular you want to use, then in a sense, isn't your silence a form of consent and complicity in their racism? And don't we know that one of the ways racism thrives is through attitudes and beliefs that go unchecked? I mean, stuff is really basic, isn't it? So the bystander approach is a way to give us a language about how to speak to people in peer cultures and in families and in friendship networks and in schools and in workplaces, to empower people to say something, to give them permission to speak, to say that the person who speaks is actually a strong person, not weak or soft. That's the other thing. In male peer culture, you'll often hear when men speak up, some men and young men their response will be to somehow shame them as if they're not really men. You're kind of soft. You're a soy boy. You heard some of these terms? You're a virtue signaler. You're politically correct. You're not one of the guys. The implication here is you're not one of the guys, right? And you're not a real man. This is so absurd on so many levels. Because let me just say this. I'll just say this for the record. If you're a guy, being one of the guys takes nothing special, zero special to be one of the guys if you're a guy. Going along with your boys, going along with the guys takes nothing special. What takes something special if you're a guy is to turn to your friends when they're being abusive in some way and saying, dude, you can't talk like that. You can't act like this. This is not cool. I can't be part of this. That takes so much more strength and self-confidence than just going along with the group. And yet the one who speaks up is somehow soft. This is like literally topsy-turvy land. This is like opposite world that I used to play with my son. But it's very powerful. Even though I think it's absurd, it's very powerful. A lot of young men remain silent. A lot of older men remain silent because they're worried that other men are going to think that they're soft, that they're not really playing for the home team, that they're really taking women's side and all this kind of nonsense. And it is nonsense, isn't it? So, the bystander approach, if it's done right, and there's different ways, people have different approaches, and you have to deal with, customizing different language, and you put together real-life scenarios, so it's not just theoretical, it's not just a speech. When we're talking about operationalizing the bystander stuff, and I know Louise does this, and we all do this, do the work. This isn't about speeches, and it's not about public sloganeering, although that's part of the support for the change. It's about granular level dialogues and interactive dialogues with young people, with older people, in workplaces, talking about real life situations. You put young men, young women, and others, older men, older women, and others in real life situations as friends or colleagues who are seeing something going on. You think about, you help them think through their ethical obligations to each other, to themselves. What am I supposed to do in this situation? And if I have a position of a leadership, I have even more responsibility. In other words, everybody in a given peer culture has a responsibility, everybody. But the people who are leaders within those spaces have even more responsibility, because part of what you're challenged with or tasked with as a leader is to set the tone in a whole organization. And therefore, you have more responsibility than the average person. But everybody has a responsibility. But I want to make this final point. The bystander approach, if done correctly, is actually a leadership approach, because the bystander who speaks up, the friend, the teammate, the colleague or coworker who sees some situation and speaks up or does something is basically acting as a leader. I'll give you an example. A 16-year-old boy whose friend tells a rape joke, right? The 16-year-old boy might have his mother be a rape survivor. And by the way, there's, I'm sorry, tons of 16-year-old boys who have mothers who are rape survivors in Northern Ireland, in my country, and they don't know it. Most of these 16-year-old boys don't know that their mothers are rape survivors because mother hasn't shared it with them. But the 16-year-old boy hears his friend tell a rape joke, and maybe he does know that his mother's a rape survivor, and maybe he does know this is nothing we shouldn't be joking about, and he says, dude, can you joke about something else? I don't find that funny. That 16-year-old boy who just said that might not in any way see himself as a leader. He might not have any credential to suggest that he's a leader, but the act of saying, dude, could you joke about something else? That's not funny, is a leadership act. Because what has he done? He's assessed a situation of potential harm. The harm here is the normalization of something that shouldn't be normalized. He's consciously or unconsciously thought about his responsibilities to women, to maybe his own mother, to himself, maybe even to his friend, because he wants his friend to be a better person than telling jokes like that suggests. And then he thinks, okay, what are my choices here? What are my options? Again, consciously or unconsciously, what are my options to do something here? And then he cycles through the options and he chooses one. His choice is to say something to his friend, and he then does that. He says something, which is another way of saying he has just executed a leadership protocol, because one of the things leaders do is assess situations, especially in this case relating to harm. They think about their responsibilities to the various parties, they think about their options, and then they choose one of those options and then they act upon it. Isn't that true? So the bystander who speaks up is actually a leader. The young person, the older person who speaks up is acting as a leader. The reason why this is such an important piece to the whole narrative is that you're asking people, you're asking people to rise to the better angels of their nature. It's aspirational and positive. Instead of, for example, with men saying, you better stop doing these toxic behaviors, we're saying we need more men who have the courage and strength to say some of this stuff, to challenge each other, to be better. We need more women and young women who have the courage and the strength to speak up, to challenge, to interrupt, and such. It's a positive push and an aspirational push rather than a don't do it message. And I think a lot of men can respond positively to that. A lot of women, a lot of others, people can respond positively to that positive challenge. And I've seen it, Louise has seen it, Graham has seen it in our work for years and years and years, is that some men and people can come into a room with their arms folded, oh my God, we're gonna get another lecture about toxic masculinity. And what they walk out with saying, oh my God, I hadn't even thought about it like that. Really, that's kind of really interesting. And there's something I can do that is really constructive. I'm convinced that there's an awful lot of people in our societies who are unhappy with the status quo. I know that there's tons of women who are unhappy with the status quo, but I also want to tell you there are a lot of men who are unhappy with the status quo, and a lot of young men who participate in certain cultural practices and behaviors and peer cultures that are not particularly proud of that fact, but they don't have the courage and the strength to speak up. And what we're helping them to do is to do that, and we're helping to give them permission by talking about this out loud, and we also powerfully giving them the opportunity to hear from their peers and their friends, and they realize sometimes that they're not alone, that they're not the only one who's unhappy with this behavior that they're seeing around them. And if they know that there's other people around them who are similarly discomfited by the abusive behavior, they're more likely to speak up than if they're the only person in the room. And remember, there's all these pressures on people, especially young people, to conform to certain kinds of norms. And standing up and speaking out is often very, very intimidating. And so the more that they can hear that other people are in the same boat and are feeling similarly, the more likely they are to speak up. But the person who speaks up is, guess what? A leader, because what a leader does is often speak when other people don't have the voice, or for whatever reason the other people don't have the guts to take that first step. That's what a leader is. So by framing the bystander approach as a leadership approach, it's positive, aspirational, and it can include everybody from 16-year-olds to 60-year-olds and everybody in between. Thank you very much.
Jackson, so much food for thought. Thank you. And we'll have the opportunity after the coffee break to think about what this means in our context, in our organisations. But now I'd like to introduce you to 3 young people, Curtis MacDonald, Katie Mallon and Leona Brownlee, who have, as young advocates, been working with Nexus. They have been part of using their voices to raise awareness around these issues. They appear as a team, and they each have one point which they're going to make in introducing their video, Share to Be Aware, which they've made with Nexus. It's a 7-minute video. I think it's fabulous and worth watching in whole.
Thank you. We've kind of lost Curtis, but he'll be here. There he is. Okay, we had a group of 4 different youth centres come together from across Belfast and created a social action project. We got a budget of £10,000 to create this project. We then created a video to spread awareness on sexual harassment and to show what it actually is and how to get help from it.
Young people, in my opinion, when given the opportunity, can be very powerful. It has given me and other younger people a stronger voice than we've ever had before this project even started. The fact that it's people from here, Belfast, we hope that they would listen and speak up about sexual harassment.
The whole point of this video is to raise awareness to youth and sexual harassment, and we hope to make an impact in schools to promote this video, as it has been Nexus vetted, so it's available to play in primary schools to universities, so we can teach different generations what a mess about is with your mates compared to sexual harassment. All of our committee loved this video because it's the first video based in Belfast, and all the actors are from Belfast, which makes it the first video to come out of it. And then we all had fun working on this video, even though some of the days were long and some were short, but we got through it in the end. But the video is worth the wait, so please enjoy.
Sexual harassment is any unwanted sexual behaviour that makes someone feel upset, scared, offended, or humiliated, or is meant to make them feel that way.
Here, Abdullah, what's that you're reading?
Oh, this? It's a leaflet from Nexus, a sexual abuse charity. They came to our school on Friday afternoon to explain sexual harassment to our year.
Oh, really? Is that like learning about sex?
Kinda. Well, no, not really. It's more like pointing out creeps, basically. But like, not everyone who might harass you is a creep, you know? It's more how to spot abusive behaviour and being aware of like sexual abuse and harassment.
Oh, here, that's class. I wish they did that with my year. So is it all about sexting then? Like, just getting sent random pics out of the blue?
It's not all about sexting. There's some other stuff too. And harassment can happen online in other ways. It's not just getting random photos.
I hear, especially out there, ex. You know who?
Ach, that's hardly sexual harassment, like. Oh, it was nothing. My fault. So, my ex leaked my nudes. They sent me some too, so I thought it would be okay. I thought it would be fun. But then, when I didn't want to send any more, I told them to stop, and it kept getting weirder. Like, all the time. They would even send me photos from my own Instagram. saying all this weird stuff about what they wanted to do to me.
And like, did you not just ghost them?
I tried, but they kept messaging even when I wasn't replying. Every time I tried to end the conversation, they got angry at me. It kept playing on my mind and my sleep was awful. It was like I couldn't escape it. I decided to block them in the end, but then they leaked my photos. It was all over the place, and loads of people saw it. People commenting about my body, rating me, as if I want to hear what they have to say, you know, like that. Ugh, yuck. The whole thing just makes me feel so disgusted. I'm so stupid for sending them. It's my own fault, really. And what's worse is it was just after we broke up, and they were like, if you won't even talk to me, then I'll post your nails all over the place. I didn't think they were serious. Like, who would do that?
Hey, it's not your fault. And yes, that is sexual harassment, Claire. That's sort of like revenge porn. And telling you that they'd leak them if you didn't talk to them is blackmail.
Claire, I'm so sorry. I didn't know it was this serious.
It is what it is, and I shouldn't have done it.
No, mate. They shouldn't have done it.
You're 100% there.
So, like, just wondering, what else is sexual harassment, Abdullah?
Alright, so there's actually a list here. So, groping.
Oh, here, that's happened to me. Happened to me at concerts. Sometimes people just grab or slap my bum just because of the way I'm dressed. Like, just because we're out to dance, have a good time and dress nice doesn't mean that you can catcall me and touch me. It makes you feel really small.
It says here, unwanted sexual contact. Is that the same thing?
Not exactly. Unwanted sexual contact is a bit less obvious, but it can still make people feel uncomfortable.
There's an older woman, Janice, at the cafe who works with me. Whenever it's quiet and there's no one around, she can come up and feel my muscles or give me a wee shoulder massage without even asking. It's so weird. She always makes wee comments about how big and strong and sexy I can be.
I bet people are like, oh, I wish I had that problem. Imagine not wanting women falling all over you. But I know what you mean. It's really annoying when you just want to get on with your life and people are constantly sexualising you.
Yes, exactly. And even if I complained about it, I'd be scared I wouldn't be taken seriously because I'm a wee lad and I can take it. I honestly really considered packing it in last week just to get rid of her. It's just becoming too much and it's getting so uncomfortable.
I also hate it when people make jokes as well. Like, just because I'm gay, everyone assumes that I'm sex obsessed and constantly makes jokes about my sexuality. It really annoys me, especially because people will think that you're no crap if you can't take a joke.
Yeah, or if you're a wee girl and you tell a wee lad to stop joking about you in a sexual way, then suddenly you're that girl and you can't take a joke.
Literally, like the other week in the change rooms after football, some of the boys were making everyone else uncomfortable. Trying to steal their towels or their clothes when they're in the shower. But it's always happening to me. Because of my gender identity, people just want to know what's in your trousers. It's inappropriate and weird. You wouldn't be asking anyone else, so don't be asking me.
There, I didn't even know that was sexual harassment. It's crazy how there's so many different ways.
Why did none of us tell anyone about this?
Well, I didn't know half the stuff he said was sexual harassment.
And it can be embarrassing too. Like, how am I meant to say to my teacher or even my mum and dad about what happened to me?
Well, there's loads of charities and support out there, like Nexus. They deal with this kind of stuff all the time, so you don't need to be embarrassed. You can even speak to someone you trust, like us, or someone in that youth club you go to.
You know, there's actually a thing here on their website. 54% of people who have been sexually harassed have said their quality of life has changed. For those who have been sexually harassed, only around half of those have reported it to someone. And for anyone who had witnessed sexual harassment, only half of these had taken action and half had not. 2 out of 3 girls in the UK have been sexually harassed in public.
You can help fight against sexual assault and harassment in many different ways. Become an active bystander, be aware of when someone's behaviour is inappropriate or threatening, and choose to challenge it when it's safe to do so.
You don't have to be a hero to make a positive impact in someone's life. You can intervene in a way that is comfortable for you and is appropriate for the situation.
If you don't feel comfortable doing this directly, then get someone to help you, such as a friend or someone in authority.
There are many amazing organisations who are there to support anyone who has or is experiencing sexual harassment.
A special thanks to Nexus for their support in creating this video.
This video was created as a social action campaign by the participants of the Belfast City Council Young Advocates Programme. This was delivered by Cooperation Ireland in partnership with East Belfast Alternatives, Holy Trinity Youth Centre, Our City and Saints Youth Centre.
The Young Advocates Programme is a cross-community youth leadership project bringing young people from across Belfast together to take part in campaigns to make changes in their community. This is funded by the Special European Union Programmes body under Peace 4.
Please scan this QR code and use the link on the screen to share with us your feedback. Thank you.
I am so impressed by that video, and I'm so impressed by Curtis and Katie and Leona. Thank you very much indeed for sharing that with us today. We have said there's something everyone can do to help. You've showed us that there absolutely is. Thank you for using your voices. I'd like to introduce someone else now who can bring the question of what bystander might look like in a specific context into the context of her professional role and her workplace. Professor Louise Crowley from University College Cork is a professor in the law department there who 7 years ago decided to set up a bystander programme in the university to deal with the issues that she was seeing around her with the students who she was teaching. Since then, she has researched and evaluated the approach that she has taken. She has rolled it out across the higher education sector in the Republic of Ireland and is piloting it at the second level. I'm sure some of you will know she's one of the leading voices in bystander approach in Ireland, and her second Captain's podcast on the subject just after poor Ashley Murphy was killed was a way that spread the word to a lot more people, and she's now working with workplaces and other organisations as well. I'll get Louise to tell you more about what she is doing right now. Louise.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you all today. I'm really honoured to be able to give you an insight into not only the work that we've done in University College Cork, but also to help you get an understanding of what it means for the participants in the training, and to give you some of the data that we've received back, some of the qualitative feedback from our participants in terms of how it has empowered them to make differences and make really effective interventions in dangerous and potentially dangerous situations that they encounter. And we know they encounter. Sexual harassment and violence is a really it's a very prevalent issue, not just at third level in the Republic, in all jurisdictions, but also, you know, as an example of society more broadly, that this is an issue that has to be tackled. And I really commend the Northern Ireland Executive and Claire for her leadership to looking at what can we actually do, how can we practically address this. And in terms of the prevention element of our response to the issue of gender-based violence, developing targeted educational initiatives that are evidence-based is so powerful in terms of empowering all of us as members of society, a society in which many of us live in a somewhat paralysed way because of our everyday actions and decisions, and particularly women and young girls having to police their behaviour and police their choices, not necessarily all because they're being attacked or assaulted, but the very fact that we live with that threat on a daily basis has to be addressed. And so, you know, as I say, I commend you for developing a strategy and for looking at the importance of education and preventive measures. So what I want to do in the next 15 minutes or so is to just talk to you about our programme at UCC and to give you, I suppose, an insight into how it can be rolled out, the nature of the learning as briefly as I can, and the way in which the both staff and students have responded to the programme. So let's see which way this goes. Up, down, back, forward. Oh no, here we go. So, okay, that's just our opening slide. This was a mural that we put on the campus wall a number of years ago, and it's just an example of highlighting the issue. So as much as we need to develop targeted initiatives, and indeed in third level, appropriate policies and pathways for reporting and supporting measures, it's really important that we keep the issue on the radar so that we validate the experiences of those who are experiencing sexual harassment and violence. And we also highlight that it is completely unacceptable, and we want to move towards a zero tolerance approach that's adopted by everybody. So these are two of our students helping with positioning these posters on the wall, identifying the types of challenges that women and girls face on a daily basis. So in terms of our programme, I suppose to put it in a nutshell, the 4 central aims of developing the UCC Bystander Intervention Programme. Well, firstly, as much as we're doing it today, it was to introduce our staff and students to the concept of being an active bystander. And just on that, because I see I just referenced students there, when the National Framework to End Sexual Harassment and Violence at Third Level was developed in the Republic in 2019, and I sat on the expert group that created that, that's the framework that requires all third level institutions to develop a wraparound response to this issue. And it was targeted at students. And in turn, the programme that I developed in 2016 was student facing. But the new Minister, Simon Harris, in 2019 expressly said, this is an all of campus issue. So now we are, we now must also ensure that everything we do is also staff facing. So now our staff and students take this training programme, and it's about awakening. And it is about awakening people's recognition that although you may not be the source of the problem, you are part of the source of the solution. And going back to what Jackson said about hashtag not all men. Not all men are perpetrators of violence or sexual harassment, but all men can do something about it. And there's nothing more powerful than a man speaking to somebody in his peer group and calling out behaviour in a way that they may switch off from me or may not necessarily value my opinion, but they will value their peers because nobody wants to be that guy who's been rejected. So we talk to our staff and our students about their role, that they have a role to play in changing the situation, in improving the lived experiences of everybody in society and in our context, the staff and students and the broader campus community. So then the second aim of the programme is the education piece. So I do see it as two-tiered. I see it as education and I see it as empowerment. So in terms of education, there's a range of things that we cover. Firstly, it's the awareness piece. You're never going to make an intervention unless firstly you're aware of something happening and secondly you see it as problematic. And I'll touch on that more in a minute. But getting students to realise they don't need to live in a world of harassment or violence. They don't need to live in a world where it's normal to go to a nightclub and get groped. And I absolutely applaud the video that the young people just showed us in terms of the everyday experience. And they're younger and younger all the time that, young people might go to a nightclub and they've said to me in feedback, I go to a nightclub and of course I get groped, Louise, because that's what happens when you go to a nightclub. Or, of course, somebody sent me a picture of their penis that I definitely didn't want to see, but I have a mobile phone, so what should I expect? And I think it's when this becomes so normalised that when are you going to challenge that if you think it's normal? Because you don't challenge something that isn't problematic in your head. So we do work very hard on working with our participants on social norms and the dangers of social norms where they are, toxic behaviours. And we also get them to realise that it's not just them who's uncomfortable, that they're living, with their peers who are also uncomfortable. But if we all remain silent, well, there's the fire that will, that will flame the ongoing perpetration of violence and harassment and everyday sexism. And then, of course, we do touch on, consent, what sexual harassment is, what sexual violence is, what constitutes aggravated sexual assault and rape. You would be shocked to know of the number of students who have experienced the most violating forms of sexual violence, including rape, and didn't report because they didn't realise it was rape, they didn't think it was serious enough. This is what they're telling us. So we have to get them to realise, rape myths are exactly that, they're myths. It's not your fault. It doesn't matter that you had a few drinks, and it certainly doesn't matter that you had sex with them last week. That's not permission to have sex with you this week. So getting back to the nub of the education, which is really critical. So before we ever become pro-social activists and making interventions, we need to understand what unacceptable behaviour looks like. So that information education piece is a critical foundation for anybody to allow them to develop and move in the direction of becoming a proactive bystander. The third piece is the empowerment piece. It's all very well to teach people what it looks like, why you should feel personal responsibility to do something about it. But this is not a call to arms, so we must be very careful when we're empowering people to know how and when to make a safe and effective intervention. The golden rule with the UCC Bystander Programme that starts every module is, you only make an intervention if it's safe to do so. If it's not safe, you call 999 112, or you find somebody who's better positioned to make the intervention. Do not put yourself in a place of harm. So we work very hard on understanding, not only are we responding to a huge range of behaviours, so everything from rape and sexual assault along the spectrum to jeering and whistling and catcalling and rape jokes and other such type behaviour, which may seem, and some people would say, down on the other end of the spectrum, lesser offences. Let's be outraged about all of those behaviours. Let's not just react to those heinous cases that we hear of a woman being murdered or raped or sexually assaulted. Of course, we're all stopped in our tracks when that happens. But let's also be horrified by somebody whistling at you out the window or grabbing you in the nightclub or whatever the case may be. None of this is acceptable. There should be no level of acceptability. And so we work on equally the range of ways in which you can respond. And I know from hearing from our students and our staff who say, bystander intervention, gosh, I thought when I started it, I was basically learning how to fist fight. I was learning how to put on a cape and dive in and sort out situations. In fact, that's very rarely the situation. And what we want to do is understand the range of ways in which an intervention can be made. Interruption, removal, distraction. Don't laugh at a joke. Tell your friend to cop on. We can't say things like don't talk like that. Like Jackson said, which I thought is a lovely, casual, easy way of calling somebody. So we need other language, but we have our own. But it's about that, and it's about being comfortable in calling out that behaviour. And it can be very subtle and very nuanced, even with a stranger or a friend. And it's also about responding to situations, whether you receive a disclosure or whether you have that conversation the next morning over coffee when you're sober. Maybe that's the easier time to make the intervention and try and shift attitudes. So that always fascinates our participants who say, wow, I never thought of it like that. There's a situation on a bus and the lads are all causing trouble and leering at a woman on the bus and she's really uncomfortable. I can't go down and stop them. Little old me, I'd be afraid something terrible might happen. But how about I look at her and say, would you like me to sit next to you? There's your intervention. You're recognising her vulnerability and supporting her. And that's brilliant for people because they can see themselves doing those easier things. You're in a nightclub, your friend, there's a guy giving a bit too much attention, it's getting maybe uncomfortable. Come on, we'll go to the loo. We've all done it. Or come on, let's go get pizza. I don't want to be here anymore. And you've dissipated the threat. Maybe nothing would have happened, but maybe something would have. And your little intervention can be so effective. And then finally, in terms of the broader culture, and I suppose why you're here today and representing so many different sectors, it's that culture piece. Is that if we are willing to identify unacceptable behaviour and say, no, that's not okay. This is not okay. Whether you're speaking to the perpetrator, or whether you're speaking to the vulnerable person, or whether you're speaking to your peer group, it's not okay that this is going on. Let's do something about it. I'm firmly of the view, and I've seen it in action, that you can affect culture change. You can demand a new normal. You can say this is not acceptable and we won't have this. And in turn, if you have sufficient buy-in and the voices collectively are loud enough, what you have is that you have that new normal. And those who are perpetrating or thinking about perpetrating, they no longer have that silent, implicit permission. What they have is they're the outlier. They're the pariah who's behaving in that way. Nobody wants to be in that group. So all those people who kind of going along for the crack are being silent, uncomfortable but silent, they'll very quickly move. They do not want to be associated with what is now identified prescribed behaviour. So just moving along, I'm useless with this. Come on, baby. Okay, so very briefly, how we delivered at UCC. 2 years in 16-17, I delivered it in person as a pilot to 600 students. It was so powerful in terms of its positive impact and the student appetite for it. We transitioned it to the online platform, and now it is self-directed online training for about 2 hours. We go through all of these issues. And then the final workshop, Workshop 5, and it's only called Workshop 5 because we've no imagination, and it was the fifth bit of the learning. That's the in-person workshop where you've completed the four modules, and we bring together people who've completed, usually groups of 12 or 14, mixed gender, and we go through the key learning, they discuss the impact, and then we do scenarios, as was mentioned earlier, where we say, so the example of the guys on the bus, what would you do? And you get the person who says, oh yeah, I'd go down the back, and I'd tell them to cop themselves on, and I always say to them, would you, all by yourself? And then they go, oh, maybe not. Someone would say, I'll go to the bus driver, and then we think, yeah, that's a bit hit and miss, because there's no policy actually on the Irish buses as to what you should do as a bus driver. And then somebody will say, I'd go sit next to the woman, or I'd ask her, would she like me to sit next to her? Or I'd simply stand between her and the guys who are giving her hassle, and you break it off, and you've suddenly made an interruption or a distraction. And so, I think we could all probably do that, or we can do what we're comfortable with. And it's about using those examples, firstly, to allow them to identify the problematic behaviour, and to do it collectively. And, as good as I might be, I'm not that good. They listen to each other. They hear each other's responses. Why do you think that's problematic? Oh, I couldn't do that. I would do this. What about if you did this? And together they're recognising, A, that they're all a bit abhorred by the behaviour, and B, they see a shared desire and appetite to be part of the change. And then they hear from each other different ways in which they can intervene. And that in itself is very empowering because you know you're not alone. And the idea, of course, is when you deliver it on one campus, you deliver it in a particular workplace, you deliver it with a particular sports team. And in UCC, we're working with, for example, the male and female rugby teams coming together. So they not only learn the training, but they learn about the impact on each other of the behaviour. So doing it all with lads is great and they get a certain insight. But when they hear about their women's experiences, something that they very often are completely unaware of, that's a whole new level of learning and buy-in as well. And in UCC, to get your UCC digital badge, you do a reflection piece. So when I first developed this, I'm a lawyer, I said, write 1,000 words, tell me what you thought. And then I realised we had musicians and artists and philosophers and engineers and all kinds of people taking the training. So now they can submit art and poetry and photography and screenplays and all kinds of amazing things. And we recently had an exhibition in the Boo Library in UCC of all of these works. And some people clearly are survivors of sexual violence. You can see it in their reflections. And just from a risk management perspective, I was very worried about re-traumatizing people when we delivered this training. But what I have come to learn, and this is what I was advised, so I'm glad it came to fruition, some of our survivors are our biggest advocates. They are now signed up bystander ambassadors because they didn't have a bystander when it happened to them, but they are so glad that this training is happening and that for the next person, perhaps there'll be a bystander who would prevent it from happening. So, 2 minutes. So just to point out, it's all of these behaviours. If you just talk about rape and sexual violence, most people in the room would say nothing to do with me. Even if you don't do it, I challenge any man in particular to tell me they weren't in the presence of a company or in a WhatsApp group where something like this didn't happen, too many negatives. And so you have a role in recognising it and calling it out. This one does not like me. So these are the 4 stages of intervention. You have to notice the event. That's the awareness piece. Some people live like this. A lot of young people are so self-obsessed, they only see their own worlds. They need to open their eyes to their friends, what's happening around them. Recognizing it's problematic, so that goes to shattering the normalization of sexual violence. Feel responsible for dealing with it. It's not you involved, why should you? Well, it's about asserting the standards you want to live in, the standards that your peer group endorse and buy into. So you do have a responsibility, and if you walk on by, well, I'm afraid you're part of the problem. And then finally, having the skills to do the right thing. So where we are, most people have healthy, let's acknowledge that. Most people are very respectful in terms of their attitudes to relationships and sexual engagements. Less so, we're in the minority of those who are problematic. However, if we stay silent, my next visual will demonstrate, I can get this thing to work. If we stay silent, that small minority in their minds becomes the majority because the silence allows them to believe they're in the majority. We create a false consensus that their behaviour is okay, a sense of permission, and we know those who are so inclined will escalate. And that's where the pyramid of violence comes in. So you might think, God, what good is telling someone to stop saying a rape joke? How's that going to save the rape victim? Well, actually, you're not born a rapist or a murderer, but if you allow these types of attitudes and cultures to develop, it feeds up that. So where we want to get to is loud, positive voice. We demand healthy and positive relationships. We call it out, and those who are engaging will become smaller. It will be so socially prescribed that people will not want to be a part of it. Can't get everybody, but we can get a lot. So finally, can I just talk about the data very quickly? So in terms of the impact of the training, so this is from our 2020-21 cohort. With 3 key questions. 1, there is little I can do about sexual harassment and violence at my institution. So before they did the training, in fairness, 54% of participants said they could make a difference, and 44% said, yeah, I have a limited capacity. When they completed the training, 92% said, I can make a difference. And the 17 then said, I can, albeit limited. That's a big jump in terms of the impact of the learning. The next slide is 21-22, so I'll just drive on from that. It's the same question. Second question, I have a good understanding of what constitutes sexual harassment and violence. Remember, if you can't recognise it, you're never going to call it out. So beforehand, 69%, yeah, I have a good understanding. By the end of the training, 96% of people felt, oh, can I hear me? Sorry. 96% of people said they could recognise it. So there's your first step straight away. I see it, and I see it's not acceptable. So that was the second key question. And the final key question, if I can get to it, is have I the capacity to do something about it? Come on. I have a good ability to intervene. So again, before the training, 22% of people said, I agree, I have a good capacity to make an intervention. We had 50 said, limited, and 23% of people said, I do not know what to do. And after the training, we had 0, I do not know what to do, We had 80% said, I agree, I have a good ability now, and 20% said, yeah, I have a limited ability. So there's the shift in ability to recognise, sense of responsibility to do something about it, and actual capacity to make an intervention. So I do have slides on my second level new programme, which I'm not going to talk to you about except in 30 seconds to say there was such a call at second level for this to be brought to younger people. We know when they come to third level, unfortunately, many young women in particular have been victims of sexual harassment, violence, rape, and a lot of young men have embedded toxic views on sexual relationships. And so I got, oh, this is also really good, but I won't dwell. Maybe we can make these available to people afterwards. It's the feedback from participants, all the different ways in which they've made interventions. I was on my way home from work. I saw a young woman sitting on the edge of the steps. She looked a bit drunk. I stopped and asked her if she was okay. Her phone was out of charge. I gave her my phone. She rang her mum. I stayed with her, but told her I was only staying close by so she would be safe. Her mum came and collected her and she went home. I would simply have walked on by because I wouldn't have known what to do before I did this programme. And there's a range of examples of all of these proactive ways in which our students and staff are making these interventions. Just to say as a final note, we're now piloting this in 45 schools across Ireland. It was 7. I got funding from the Irish Research Council, and after Aisling Murphy was murdered, I was inundated with requests across all sectors, but was able to respond to the second level because I had a pilot programme started. We now have 45 schools involved. I trained 140 teachers in March. It's rolling out in TY, which is 15 and 16-year-old boys and girls schools, and already the feedback is the students are so grateful. They're finally being taught, reflecting the lived reality that they have. We didn't hold back on the fact that they're using porn, the fact that they're sexting, the fact that they're having sexual relationships, and it allows them to discuss it in a safe place. Interestingly, one thing a teacher said to us, the boys couldn't believe the impact on the girls of what they thought were just comments and jokes. And a lot of boys believed that sexual harassment and has to be physical in nature to impact on a girl. And that's just a tiny little sample of what they're learning. So sorry that it's so rushed there at the end. I'm very happy to share the slides that demonstrate the impact on the ground, the changes that are happening, and also, finally, how the appetite is there. People want to learn this. People want to be able to make the most subtle but effective interventions to change what's happening, to change the dance of the everyday sexual hostility and harassment. And this is transferable across sectors, workplaces, sporting organisations, because I am working with them. And there's such an appetite, I can't keep up with it. So it is worth your time, it is worth your investment, and I would encourage you to really consider it as part of your strategy. So thank you.
Louise, excuse me, thank you so much. That was so energising and so good to hear of the work that's going on. There's going to be a very short comfort break now. You've all been working very hard. We have a discussion question in groups. The question is going to be, what needs to be done in Northern Ireland to expand the implementation of the bystander approach in wider society? And you may want to think about it in your sector. We're going to separate into table discussion groups for those of you who are in the room. The tables are down here. A member of our team will take some notes so we can do feedback. There will be 2 groups in the room, one of wider society, including workplaces and sport. And the second one will be youth organisations, schools and higher education, and our team will direct you to your tables. If you're online, here's what you need to do. First of all, make sure you have renamed yourself. There are a lot of people, so not everybody is going to be able to go to your first choice discussion group, but you will have been assigned to a group. The Zoom facilitator will prompt you to unmute your microphone once we're all in the groups. It may take a moment for the breakout rooms to open and start. If you've any technical issues, please contact conference@plannd.co.uk. Now, we thought this would be a great opportunity for those of you who are online to have a chance to interact with some of our speakers and our local experts. So, online, are we doing the focus group first, or we're coming back and doing the focus group, but we're doing the panel first and then we're doing the focus group. Right, when we come back after the very short comfort break, which is now, we're going to do the panel discussion with some of our local experts and also with Graham Goulden, who's been leading this approach in Scotland. And then we are going to do the focus groups. And the focus groups will be led by, I'll tell them that now, Jane, is that right? Yes. Kelly Andrews, the CEO of Women's Aid Belfast and Lisburn, and Paula McCalliskey, Rural Women's Network, who will be dealing with the wider society network. Youth organisations, who will be speaking to Elaine Crory from Raise Your Voice. Schools, who will be speaking to Graham Goulden and Lindsay Farrell, the Deputy Secretary in the Department of Education. Third level education, who will be speaking to Professor Louise Crowley and also Dr. Susan Lagdon from the University of Ulster. Workplace, who will be speaking to Paula Murphy, Nuala Murphy surely from Diversity Mark, and Lindsay Fisher from PSNI. And if you are in the sports group, you will have the chance to speak with Jackson Katz. So 5-minute comfort break. We are timing you. There are toilets down this way and also downstairs at the front and on the left. And we'll see you back here in 5.
Now you sitting there home alone, no trip, bring your friends along and let's go.
So if you'd like to take your seats, and we're ready for a panel discussion. Now, Louise and Jackson have already spoken to us today, but I'm going to ask each of our other 3 panel members, it's Graham Goulden from Scotland, Elaine Crory from Raise Your Voice, and Kelly Andrews from Women's Aid, to just tell us briefly a little bit about what they are doing in the world of bystander training. And then there's going to be an opportunity to ask questions, so get your questions ready. But I'd like to start, Graham, with you.
Thanks very much. And I have to shoot in about 15 minutes. I'm doing a training with 15 schools from England, from Stormont. It's a first for me to do this. You know, doing bystander work, so the Jackson's MVP programme, the Mentors and Violence Prevention programme that I talked about this morning, was starting their journey, school. So I thought about my background is policing. I spent 30 years in policing in Police Scotland, and the last 9 years of my policing career as a Chief Inspector with the Violence Reduction Unit. And it was in those last 9 years that I became a bystander geek. And I'm sitting next to another bystander geek as well, I think, with Louise. I really believe in the power of that third person, right? Not only to intervene and support victims and challenge harmful behaviour, but to create cultures of safety which support learning, cultures of safety which support productivity in the workplace, cultures of safety in policing that builds public confidence and trust. That's key, and that's what active bystandership can do. It can build trust and confidence, not only within an organisation, but to support the brand, the reputation of that organisation. And so I work in all of these different settings. My work with the police is in the United States, but I'm now starting to work with an English police force who are very interested in a pilot, so watch the space for this type of conversation. But as I said, I really believe in the power, and having worked in your communities over these last couple of years virtually, there's a lot of curiosity out there. And there's a lot of wonderful people who want to do the right thing. And Louise talked about the evidence around bystander approaches. It's the same evidence that I get when I'm working with different groups. Let's get out there and give our communities the tools, the belief that they can do something. Efficacy is really, really important for bystanders. But another passion of mine is the way we speak to boys and men on this topic. And I want to that campaign you did. I don't know if you realise that, but you are following a recognised social norms campaign journey, which is to be positive, to be inclusive, and to be empowering. Because we tend to, tell young men you need to get consent. Yeah, so we focus on the sort of negative. That's important, totally important, and but it's the balance. How do we balance? We talked in the discussion this morning about the need to talk about victims' experiences and the horrible things that's happening, but how do we balance it with some of the positives? And hearing some of the voices from all of you today and in that film, you balance it really, really well. You allow young people to see the goodness that's in community. So you are doing what works. What doesn't work is telling people not to do things. What does work is positive messages like that and creating the conversations in all our different communities where men in particular have the chance to listen to each other. Men lack confidence because they don't, and Jackson, we've talked about a lot today, they lack the confidence that they're going to be supported. But the evidence says that if men speak up, and we do it rightly, other men will follow. Other men are deeply uncomfortable with this work. So it's a pleasure to be here today and yesterday and work alongside Jackson and Louise and others talking about a real passion of mine. I really believe, as I said before, everyone here has the power to make a difference. And often we just lack the confidence and the tools to do so. So thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you very much, Graham. I know you have to shoot on in a minute, but thank you for just taking that time with us. Elaine, would you like to speak about the work of Raise Your Voice?
Yes, thank you. So my name's Elaine Corey. I work for an organisation called the Women's Resource and Development Agency, and we are one of 4 women's organisations who run this project called Raise Your Voice. There's also the Northern Ireland Rural Women's Network, the Women's Support Network, and Reclaim the Agenda, who are kind of a campaigning body. And we came up with the idea for Raise Your Voice during a time when there was a lot of media focus on some high-profile cases of sexual violence. And what was really clear to us was there was a huge gap in people's knowledge about, for example, what is and isn't consent, what is and isn't quote-unquote okay behaviour. But also there was a huge gap in people's willingness to talk openly in any way about anything that was even vaguely related to sex, relationships, never mind the violent side of sex. And I think an awful lot of it, we thought about this in multiple different ways, and we figured that an awful lot of it comes from, we have a very particular history here where we think about communities and we think about the history of this place as being dominated by violence, the kind of violence we can talk about. It was on our news every single day for 30 years, but we can't talk about that kind of violence. That kind of violence, that kind of problem is behind closed doors. It's for a problem for a domestic situation or for a relationship situation and uncomfortable to talk about. And we wanted to bring that out into the open. So we spent about a year working, a little more than a year actually, because COVID came along in the middle of it, but working with women and girls and talking to them about, their own experiences, what is and isn't, what has and hasn't crossed the line, theoretically and in practice. So we look at a lot of hypothetical situations. Show me the sexual harassment in that situation. And we have those kind of conversations. We talk about consent. We talk about how the media sometimes makes it really hard for us to see what's really happening behind it with misleading headlines and that kind of thing. And then we expanded to start talking. We did the same work again with men and boys, and we found that we had to spend a lot more effort for the real impact of the quote-unquote lower level sexual harassment to be appreciated and understood. So from those 2 years of work, we developed some new trainings. One of them is focused on bystander training because I've been a long-term follower of Jackson's, long-term. And also because I have my own experience in which a bystander stopped a situation from escalating into something much worse than it would have been. And I know it works because it's worked for me. But also because we wanted to be able to give people positive tools. We always try to finish our training with, here's what you can do next. Right? Take this home with you. Take these 5 little nuggets of information. And they're small, so that they're doable. They have been way more popular than we anticipated. We've also done an online harassment one specifically because young people have asked us to, but also because women in public life have asked us to. And we've done ones around allyship, like building a community, not talking about communities, but community. What kind of world do we want to live in and make for ourselves and our children and so forth? So these have been really, really popular. And I think it demonstrates that our inkling at the very beginning, where we're all afraid to talk about it, was true, but also we're all itching to talk about it. We really, really want to do it. So that's what we do.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elaine. And last but not least, Kelly Andrews from Women's Aid.
Hello. Women's Aid have had a very busy 2 years, as you can imagine. We provide emergency refuge accommodation to women and children who are fleeing their homes because of domestic abuse. And we also provide community support programmes across Northern Ireland. I was lucky enough to meet Jackson and hear him speak when he was over at the Justice Institute in 2018. And Graham also spoke at our conference a couple of years ago in Belfast. And listening to the bystander model, we've been able to use that particularly in our youth services and with our young young people about challenging out bullying, but also looking at their behaviours and much of what Louise is doing, but on a very practical sort of local level with children. There's been doing an awful lot of work there, but it's something that I'm very interested in using the bystander model out to call out victim blaming, because we hear an awful lot about victim blaming. You know, just this morning I was at a meeting and it was reported to me at a multi-agency meeting that a non-molestation order, for those of you who are familiar with it, was breached, and that the perpetrator walked past the woman's home, and a professional said, she's only walking past the home. And it was called out by a Women's Aid member of staff, but there was other members as well. Well, what's the effect that's happening on the woman that's fearful? There's a non-molestation order there for a reason. It's a protective order. So you have all these new legislation which has come through, which we very much welcome, and Women's Aid campaigned really, really hard for, and we're very vocal about it, including the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. So we have the Domestic Offences Bill, we have the Stalking legislation and the Justice Bill. Fantastic pieces of legislation. But we have a long way to go before there's an understanding within professionals, social services, policing, voluntary community sector and society generally, on what that means. And when you look at Aisling Murphy's name's been mentioned a couple of times today, but you don't hear about Kiva Morgan or Alison Nelson or the other young women, the 13 other women that were killed in Northern Ireland since the pandemic, who were murdered in their own home. When it's, you know, they liked partying, or how they're portrayed, or they show these photographs, you know, and it's almost, because it's like an intimate partner relationship, it's almost they're complicit in some way in their own murder, and that victim blaming element. And I think we really need, as a society, to look at ourselves a bit more, and we all have a responsibility to call out that victim blaming. And I know there's been an awful lot of work done with the media. Alison Morris was involved as well, was working with Women's Aid and other to issue guidelines on how it's reported, because I'm sure you've all seen some of the shocking guidelines, man murdered cheating wife, you know, type thing. So it's her fault, she was cheating, so that's why she got murdered. And I think, you know, we all have a responsibility, and that's where bystander comes in as well. It's calling out victim blaming, and I've certainly called it out in my time, and I'm sure I'll be doing it again.
Thank you very much indeed, Kelly. Thank you. Now is your chance. If you're online, I'm afraid you need to keep your questions for the focus group. But if you're in the room, does anyone have a question for any or all of our speakers? Yes, gentleman at the back. Here's a mic coming for you.
My name is Philip O'Hara. I'm managed safeguarding for the Catholic Church in most of Northern Ireland, it's Diocese of Down and Connor, and my work covers a range of areas. You know, I manage the allegations, the suspicions, concerns. I also work with survivors and victims. But an important element of our work, an equally important element of our work, is the provision of training for our parish volunteers. And I'm talking about thousands of volunteers who will engage in safeguarding. And I was interested in some of the comments that were made at this, during the presentations about risk reduction. And I'm concerned that possibly our training is about risk reduction as opposed to introducing the concept of bystander training, and you know, and we talked about it's everybody's responsibility, but it's my responsibility, and that's what I'm looking at, what I can do in terms of my organisation to try and begin that introduction. And I just would welcome comments from any of the panel who may have an idea or experience of how the bystander approach could work within that sort of broad church setting.
Jackson, do you want to start? Yeah, because I believe in giving our visitors the difficult questions.
Could I ask you just a follow-up? Do you train, you said volunteers, and what do they volunteer to do?
These are volunteers within the parish setting who would be working with children and young people in a range of environments. So within each parish, 86 parishes across the diocese, and before a volunteer can work with children and young people, they need to do safeguarding training. So that's the context of that, if that explains it a bit.
And in what capacity are they doing this, working with young people?
It could be youth work, it could be children's liturgy, and it's not necessarily just tied in with pastoral work of the church. It's any involvement with children and young people within a church setting, within a parish setting.
Okay. And I assume those are adults you're talking about?
Sorry, these are adults, yes. Adults.
And men and women?
Men and women, yeah.
Well, I appreciate the question. I can just try to be concise.
Do you want to have a think? And I might start with Women's Aid, and then we can come back to you. You can.
I could have answered, but
no, answer.
The answer is 100%. You can integrate all of this into the mandatory training for all those people tomorrow if you wanted to. And we have the materials, we have the ideas. It's a fundamental concept. The bystander stuff is a fundamental concept. The leadership stuff is fundamental. The ways in which everybody in a given peer culture can play a constructive role, but those of us who are in positions of leadership and guidance, teachers, mentors. I mean, the name of my program is Mentors in Violence Prevention. The whole model was based on the idea that we wanted, this is not exactly what you're asking, but is we wanted to train slightly older young people to work with slightly younger people. So in other words, we train in high schools, 11th and 12th graders to work with incoming 9th graders, because it's not adult authority figures who are guiding or facilitating a dialogue. It's slightly older kids. And in university, same thing. But in your case, you're talking about adults who are working with kids, and so exposing them to all of these ideas, these dynamics about what goes on in peer cultures, the way that they can use their platform of influence as adults with young people, based on some of these concepts. 100% you could do it, and it's just a question of customizing it for the audience. And I would say, especially for a lot of the men, and not exclusively, because I know women obviously are part of this too, but giving them ideas about how they as men can present themselves to the young boys and girls, and there's a whole body of literature on that. Like, in other words, thinking about the gendered nature of all this. The one thing that I know in my research before I came here is there's this pressure for gender neutrality in some of this discourse. These are not gender neutral problems, okay? The gender neutral, you can be inclusive and still be honest, and being honest means men are the ones doing the most of the abuse, women are mostly the victims. And by the way, there are plenty of men who are the victims of other men's violence, right? So I think helping men think through the ways they can talk about this subject, because a lot of men are very uncomfortable with this. They don't have the narrative, they don't have the language, and as a result of feeling uncomfortable, not having the language, they often retreat to do nothing, or they defer to women in their colleagues and others, which is great on one level. I'm appreciative of the women's leadership and their activism, but that's not fair. Shouldn't be their burden. Shouldn't be their sole burden. And a lot of those men are just good people who need to be doing more. And so giving them the tools to do that more effectively, you could do that 100%.
Thank you very much, Jackson. Kelly, what would you like to add?
Just to say that there is a training available. I mean, Women's Aid deliver training, Nexus deliver training, and the Belfast Domestic and Sexual Violence Partnership, which is a multi-agency partnership, actually delivered free online training for church leaders not that long ago. Some of you might be aware of this. And I know Women's Aid have recently worked with GB on developing a healthy relationships badge. I know it's not quite the same thing as the bystander model, but there is specialist work that can be done with different agencies and organisations to meet the needs, because it's a fantastic model, and there's certainly skills and expertise out there which you can bring in to help support your staff to deliver that training.
Elaine?
Just I agree with everything that's been said, but I wanted to add, maybe get in touch with Corrie Mila, because they're developing sort of multi-denominational fora and training specifically around how churches of various sorts respond to incidents of domestic and sexual violence. And they've been working on these for a while, and are now looking at churches to take them on and pilot them. So this might be just exactly the right timing for this. So get in touch with Corrie Mila in the city as opposed to up in Corrie Mila.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much, Elaine. And finally, Louise.
Just very briefly, immediately it strikes me correlation with the GAA and how equally, so I'm a volunteer in the GAA and I had to do my child protection training and all the rest. And if you think about the function of that is to ensure that as adults working with young people that we are appropriate, that we've been vetted. So that's very much risk prevention type approach, as you said. And I think that we need to see coaches and volunteers within the church, within sport or elsewhere, as actually having a really positive mentorship type role. And sometimes we get so caught up in making sure everybody is appropriate and well behaved and understands parameters and has been vetted, that we forget about flipping it over and saying, wow, I can upskill and empower this person to be a leader, to demonstrate to young people, first of all, how I live my life, and I won't accept unacceptable behaviour or invasive behaviour, but also I can support them in their engagement with their peers in also being a strong voice for change and giving them those skills and that self-belief, but also that sense of responsibility insofar as it's appropriate for sort of demanding and asserting certain standards. So I think it's really vital that we, whilst recognising the importance of the child training and protection piece, that we embrace the capacity for positive enforcement and change in leadership.
Thank you very much indeed, everyone. We have time for maybe 2 questions. We'll take both questions together and give everyone the opportunity to answer. Yes, down at the far end.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to ask if a part of the project or strategy, is there any measures in there to actually support and encourage girls to actually report, you know, anything inappropriate, whatever level it is? Because, you know, we're asking, which is brilliant, and I'm really impressed by the work of the young people here, but we're asking students and teachers to implement strategies that often are not implemented further up, you know, with the people in positions of power and the people who are paid to take responsibility and to be accountable and to put pressure on things that happen in our society. So we're asking a lot of young people to be very brave and stand up to people, but if they're not supported when they do stand up, you know, it's a part of prevention is consequence. And I'm a teacher myself for a long time, and a part of any way that a child learns in school from a young age and a teenager is by one, their role models, the adults around them that are taking this robust action, and also by knowing that if they do take action, they are going to be supported. So I was just wondering if there's any sort of measures around there within the strategy. Thank you.
That's a very, very important question. I'm going to start at the far end with Louise. I'm also going to ask the people who are facilitating our online breakout groups, if you could go to the room with the Zoom now, that would be fantastic. But not you. No, you stay there. But if you're in the audience, if you're facilitating, now would be a time to move before we take our last question. But Louise, I think we spoke about this morning in the higher education group.
So certainly at third level, the targeted education initiatives are just one piece of the jigsaw. So ensuring that we give the students and the staff the information, the knowledge, the skills, the capacity, but that does not exist in a vacuum. So first of all, I would have done a lot of risk management, both at third level and second level, with the fear of re-victimizing people. I don't want someone to realise, oh, I've been assaulted, I'm going to say it out loud, but what happens next? I'm standing at the edge of a cliff. So ensuring that we have appropriate reporting mechanisms, both anonymous and formal, but also appropriate and accessible and transparent support services. So that's obviously at third level. We have student counselling, student health, and we have a robust reporting system that is signposted, accessible. You know that when you say A, B will happen and then C will happen, and that's really important. And at second level, we've ensured with all of the schools that they have, some didn't have any, so developed visible and accessible policies for the young people. You've identified champions within the school. So as a young person, you've heard this in class, you know who the people are who are trained in the school that you can go to, and that you know that they will hear you and provide you a pathway to support. So none of these developments can happen in a vacuum. They have to be considered and positioned within wraparound supports that are, you know, that are meaningful, accessible, not a geographical lottery, and there has to be a visible, as I say, pathway for someone who expresses, makes a disclosure, that they know what will happen when they speak up, because we know that people won't disclose for all kinds of reasons, including the fear of the consequences of speaking up. And we need to recognise and applaud those who are brave enough to speak up, either in terms of making an intervention or also making a disclosure. And finally, we need to make sure that the young people know how to receive a disclosure, because we know at third level the majority of disclosures, when they are made to their peers, and those peers are also vulnerable in terms of the pressure that it puts on them to A, support their friend, and B, also self-care. So it's complex, it's layered, and it's important, and it's a really good question because it recognises that complexity.
We could talk all day, but the team are telling me very clearly that we cannot talk all day. So I'm going to ask each of our panel if they have one closing thought before we move into our focus groups. Jackson. Yeah, sure, I just...
Well, one of the things that I often say in my general talks, not like tied directly to the bystander thing, is we have to break down the artificial distinction between violence in the family and violence on the streets, violence in the home and violence in the community. There's no peace on the streets if there's no peace at home. We can't say that we have a peaceful community because there's no, explicit political violence if in home after home there's violence. So I think, and I said this the last time I came to, well, the first time I came to Belfast, the history of your country and certainly the city over the past generation of trauma and violence is still living today. It's still part of your families and communities. It's still playing out in so many different ways, right? And this is all, what we're doing here and what you're all doing is a healing way forward, both for the particular problems that you've had with the troubles and such, but also these are issues that are bigger than that as well. But working on reducing violence and gender-based violence is working to reduce all forms of violence. And so much of the violence that men commit against other men has some of its roots in violence done to men and boys when they're young, and the trauma that they then transfer to other people because of the way gender plays. So thinking about the connections between the domestic and sexual violence field and other forms of harassment, abuse, and violence, including organized violence, including gang violence, including political sectarian violence, is really an important piece of moving forward. And I'm just happy to be part of this. And I appreciate it, once again, the honor of this participation. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Kelly?
I think it's wonderful we're having events like this today where we have an opportunity to have this debate and this discussion. We have a commitment from government to have a violence against women and girls strategy. To really demonstrate that commitment, I would like to see appropriate funding put behind that strategy. So that's funding not just for like the likes of Women's Aid and voluntary community sector support services, but for policing, for the Department of Education, for health. If you're going to make a real difference, and PBN probation board for a perpetrator strategy, if you want to make a real difference in society, well, we're going to need some funding to deliver it and to be a driver and to make it happen.
Thank you, Kelly. Elaine.
I'm going to build on what Kelly has just said, and not only because I was also going to say fund it, but really do fund it and put your money and your energies where your mouth is. If I tell you I want to be a concert pianist, but I never practiced a piano, that isn't a serious hope. That's a vague dream. If you actually want to tackle violence against women and girls, come to events like this. Take seriously what experts are telling you. And I'm talking about ministers and departments and civil servants and everybody else. When you are told, for example, we need to do something about RSE in schools, we need to. We really do. Listen to the experts about what's going to work and what's not going to work, as opposed to perhaps sometimes quite partisan political views that sometimes cloud best practice. And I'm saying that because I can be cheeky right now. I'm sitting on a stage with a microphone, but seriously, do something. There's no point in saying I take it very seriously and turning up to memorials when another woman is murdered if you're not actually going to do something on Monday morning when you go into your office. So yeah, put your money and your actions where your mouth is.
Thank you.
I'll very briefly end on a positive note. I want you to know, and my one regret is that I didn't be greedy and say, give me 2 more minutes, because I would love to have shared with you what people are doing on the ground. I'm a very practical academic, less so writing books and more so let's make the world better. And I know, and I want you to believe in this, I want you to know that on the UCC campus, young people are stopping strangers and they're supporting their friends. They're supporting them on disclosures, but they're also preventing things from happening on a regular basis. I know it, they tell me in the focus groups. So I want you to leave today with a real sense of ambition, that this can work, this can make a difference. We're not just up here philosophizing, this works. And so we need everybody to embrace this. We want you to believe in it, invest in it, and please have the ambition that this can happen and this can address the issue insofar as we can. And I'm hoping that you can share my slides. I want you to read the words of the participants and what they have on their own bat done on the basis of being exposed to the bystander approach and how it has empowered them to change what would otherwise could be devastating outcomes. So be ambitious and just go for it.
Thank you very much, Louise. Thank you to our panel. Now, if everyone would like to go to their focus groups, if you're online, the link should appear very shortly. It may take a couple of breaths. We'll take 20 minutes in our focus groups, and at 4:15, we'll come back here to hear what you've been talking about. Thank you. Right. Are you picking me up? Great. I hope that everyone online had as illuminating and interesting and inspiring a conversation as we had in the room. We're on the final furlong now. I'd like to invite Jane Brady, the head of the Civil Service, to come and reflect a little on the feedback that we've had and a little on her views of the conference, and then I'll close up by just talking a little bit about next steps. Jane.
Thank you very much. And I say we have waited for the sun to come out as well and join us here today. And it reflects, I think, the energy and the mood in the room. And online, we had continued high attendance. So 85 here today and 192 online who stayed during that session, which I guess shows just the dedication and interest and importance of this subject. So some of the key themes was about starting the conversation and who is best to start that, whether it's youth workers, social services, parents, educators. There was a key theme that came out about the need for effective RSE provision, and I know that came up in the discussions we had here as well in the sessions. And what the potential also to roll out strategic plans. But how do we do that? And I think that's with the work we're doing with Claire and the team is actually how do we make these strategies implementable? How do we fund that? How do we put the resources behind that again? Messages came out earlier. And I guess tying into those discussions is we need the buy-in from the leaders. So this is about how all of this society can play its part, but I fully take on board that leadership and those in authority have a critical position to shine a light on this, but also to lead from the front and to be seen, to setting the tone and supporting those in a whole of society approach. There's discussions about looking towards sports club captains as advocates, again, tying into that leadership role, the champions, those people who are looked up to within those groups. And again, resounding emphasis on funding is important, and the need for consistency across all clubs and cohesion provided. Emphasis came out as well about setting the example for relationships and not just romantic ones, but also for friendships. And I guess that the complexity of all those friendships can provide. And looking for a trauma-based approach, and I know Claire has been working to support me in terms of getting more knowledge in that through Circle of Courage and looking at young people and their potential. I guess a few reflections from me. I'm in the post 10 months, and I mentioned to some of colleagues earlier yesterday that in my interview for this job, they asked me for my kind of scenario, to say how I would design a strategy for violence against women and girls, and actually that gave me such hope in the civil service that was their case study, and that's where they were calling out that was important to look towards that. But had I sat, and I had a flip chart just like you, Jackson, and I drew, and I'm a systems engineer, so I had systems and flows. But actually what this is showing to me is the power of all of society and an all joined up approach, and that's that international approach. And Jackson making time to travel over from the US to be here with us today, and this isn't his first trip as well. Our colleagues from Cork making the time and all the dedication and learning from that, and also Graham from who obviously is prior practice and experience within his professional criteria now in his new role. So the role that we all have to play in terms of delivering this, and it isn't simply a one-size-fits-all strategy. We need to look towards all those complex areas. I guess a reflection I also had about some of the comments is what you walk by is what you accept, and the role for us all in terms of being active and being involved in that conversation, how important it is. Piece for me, and I guess talking to Claire, I talked about the pyramid. I chair the strategy for violence against women and girls, which is one of my great pleasures in the service. But I talked to Claire about the pyramid, and this is the pointy bit of it, but those layers down below. I'm a female engineer. I'm the first female head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service substantially. I worked as an engineer, under 10% of females. I worked as a venture capitalist, again under 10%, so underrepresented group. So for me it was about the story about women and children and girls and their position in society, which then to a point was impacted at a level which could involve violence. But actually what I took from this session is I have three children, boys and girls. This is as much for our boys and our men that it is for our girls. So I want my girls to have the best outcome and chances in life. But towards the position of this is where we show our children leadership, our boys leadership, and this is where we equip them with the skills for them to have the best outcomes in life as well. So I guess it just resonating with all the learnings that I personally have taken from this as well. I just want to thank Claire and Geraldine and the team and Jane and all for bringing all this together, and I guess the involvement and all the work that's gone into this so far, but actually the long roads that we have ahead. I want to thank you all for being here, and we will be reaching out in terms of engagement and how we bring this forward in terms of the call for views and our feedback. But this is not something that we can solve in an office in the civil service. This is something that we need to provide the environment to bring through those threads, but this is an all of society, all of Northern Ireland approach. I want to thank our speakers for making time to come over. I think Louise is heading back, we'll be back to midnight tonight. So thank you so much, and Jackson so kindly coming in from flying, and Graham as well for his commitment. There's so much we can take and feed back into this. And I want to thank you all for being here and present in terms of participating in this as well. And I think this is the start of a conversation and one I look forward to delivering on. And I give you my personal commitment that I will be driving this forward from within the civil service as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane, and your commitment to this means a great deal. I'm sure it would be useful for me to say what's happening next. Now, through the day, I have been saying we are running forward with this bystander approach in one way because it's a way of starting a conversation. We're going to be working on a co-design process on the strategy so that we have got all of the 4 pillars of prosecution, protection, prevention and policy coordination. We've thought about all of them. We're going to be doing that through the autumn with the aim of producing a draft by the end of the year. That will then be shared for full public consultation, for equality impact assessment, for all of those things. And we hope that you will all be involved in those processes through stakeholder networks, through consultation responses, through engaging with us. We'd like to stay in touch with you. We have a web page which is in development. In the meantime, we'll be making our announcements on the Executive Office Twitter. And we hope that because this is an all-of-society issue, there is something that everyone can do to help. We hope that you have taken that message away today. I'd like to thank the team here in Parliament Buildings who have put on a wonderful spread. The facilities are second to none. They've been very, very good to us. The team at Planned who have made sure that we were online and that all of our tech worked. My own team, the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls team, really the amount of work that has gone into this, I'm delighted that it has come together and that everyone has had the opportunity to hear our great speakers, to hear our great local speakers, to network and to share your own experiences. Before we finish, I'm going to put a poll question up on the screen. Is that going to pop up now? Those of you who are listening online, I'd like you to, when it pops up on your screen, just vote in the poll, and we want to know what you think. Those in the room, are you leaving here feeling empowered to help end violence against women and girls? If you agree, yes, I am, raise your hand. Thank you. And if anyone's not sure yet, raise your hand. And if anyone thinks, no, it didn't hit the mark for me, raise your hand. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Safe home.